Oh, wow, at least you
Yes.
saw something pretty. Beautiful. Oh, yeah.
Okay, you.
Colorado colors, so they were about deal. They have to write around it. Yeah, I figured it out. Oh, which brings you last week? Yeah. Yeah, that's all. The new car, so many things changing. Got to be on.
Yes. He was. Bob is just so not dynamic in person.
Yes.
Oh, I know you can never get questions.
Today.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm going. Yeah. There's just one of there's big changes.
Yes.
It's gonna highlight everything. So this is. Something right? Yes. So got the bomb. I executed a contract this weekend. Executed a contract this weekend. And they didn't have the updated in the system yet, so I used the old. Is that okay?
Well, that's what I'm talking about. If I don't answer the question, then I answer.
I was looking.
Bob, what are you talking about here?
Well, it's a Plano deal all around.
It's a what?
It's AW Plano deal.
Who's the other agent?
Chris T. Myers.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, I've done it.
That means.
Who's listening?
Huh?
Who's listening?
Listening.
Okay.
It's Charlie and our buyer.
Nice guy.
Yeah.
In our house, there should be a tax class. Yeah, he started last time we had, but it's enough to. This is where we're just. Well, John's question is. Next. One copy.
If you haven't,
Yeah, changes. Yeah, I'll return.
Yes.
if you downloaded it and you've already got it, thank you for that.
How are you? Good. I know.
Think so. It seems like a year ago.
Thank you for being here. In honor of TCU. Purple. I didn't go there. I'm a University of Houston alum. But, you know, it's so cool to have somebody. The reality is, regardless of what happens tonight, it's incredible they're even in that game.
Yes.
For them to be in that game is amazing.
Why is that?
Little school of less than 10,000 in Fort Worth, as opposed to all the huge universities.
Yep.
And you've got a coach at first year at that college to be at that level is amazing. It's just, you know,
It's insane.
really is, and we're, so they play Georgia, who is just great. Although we got to remember, Georgia barely squeaked by that last game. The only way they won is a field goal kicker missed the field goal at the very last second.
Yeah.
And Georgia won by 1 point.
The win's a win.
A win is a win. So, you know, it's going to be very exciting. So we're excited to have it go. I went from Hardin Simmons in Abilene the college of, at that time, about 2,000 to the University of Houston, whose School of Business was over 5,000. And the university was even more than that. So at that point in time, it was a great commuter school for me, but, you know, at that time, no real street or whatever like TCU's got. So that's way exciting. So award this partly for that. And the other is one of our fine agents. She might be on Zoom. I don't know. Carol Thompson. One is I had one of these nice, you know, colors. She said, you need that's great, Bob. Bright and cheery colors. You need that to go with your cheery personality. Now, I made up the cheery personality part, but she did say about the color. So it's kind of cool. I think that's great. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. Does everybody have the material? Okay, any questions? Second, I had no point in me keeping it all going if you've already got it all down. And Brooke, I was just kidding, so don't, Brooke said, oh, yeah, Bob, let me. Now, we kind of talked before about these changes. And we're going to go a little bit more into the concepts of the changes. In the class we did before, we used the draft form that was Texas Realtor and On Track. And what we're doing today is using the official new form. And there are some minor changes, not huge, but some that went from the draft form to this form here. We're going to talk a little bit more about the concepts of the changes, because as you know, real estate's not a memorization business, it's a concept business. You need to understand what's going on behind. And some of the changes, in the first one we'll talk about, on page 1 of the 1 to 4 family contract, paragraph 3, we're going to talk about that language on the cash saying. Are we good back there with Max with copies? We good?
Oh, we only got one left.
So could we make maybe a few more? A few more, that'd be good.
What needs one? I have an extra, so everybody one at home.
Everybody good? Everybody have one? Okay, thank you for that. So we're gonna look at the concepts because these changes were made to address, to deal with certain kinds of things that we deal with in the business. And it's important for you to understand how it impacts on the transaction and how it might affect your client as you go through that. And by understanding the concept of it, you're going to be in a better situation to be able to do that. One of the other things is anytime there are changes, especially fairly significant changes like the language we have in paragraph 3A, he went to make some more copies. So he went to make some more, so we should have some more material in a minute. Okay, thank you. And we'll find that in those changes that we sometimes have a shaking out period. That what we've got right now may not be what we end up with over time. We'll have to make some changes and it all comes down to what legally happens, because the key in all of this, key in the contract is, you know, the enforceability, the actions of the parties, what they can do, what they can't do as you work through all that.
Yep.
As you do it. So it's really important as we go through this, think about transactions you're in the middle of that you're doing and what's going on with you, and see how that relates to kind of what we talk about as we work through it. Because there are not a huge number of changes, but there are some, the changes are significant. They really impact on what the clients do in the transaction. Now, before we even go into all the changes, let's talk a little bit about the process we're in right now. We're in a situation that the new contract forms were approved in Trek's November meeting, November 7th of last year. And so technically you could pull up one of those at that point in time. You couldn't because they weren't on zip forms or in software. You could use the new form at that point in time because it had been approved. But we went through a time frame from November 7th of last year to February 1st of this year in which you could use either form. Totally a choice of the principals. One of the things is that Trek has a rule, and it's remember who Trek regulates. It's you. It's not the principals. It's not the parties. It regulates you. And you're required to provide the most current appropriate contract form to the client. And you're required to do that. And that's on really two levels. One, the appropriate contract form, for example, maybe unimproved property contract form versus improved property, 1 to 4 family versus farming ranch, the appropriate contract form based on the type of property. And then the appropriate from a current standpoint, that it's currently legal to use that form. Now, the principals can do anything they want to do. Remember in Texas, buyer and seller can sit down with a blank piece of paper and write out a contract. Sign off on it, get it done, and go send it to the title company and close the deal. But our obligation is to provide them, here's the paper. Here's the correct document. We're going to give you advice about it. Now, in this interim period from November 7th to February 1st, knowing that you can use either one, you need to know the differences. So when we look at these concepts, we kind of relate to, okay, that's a little different situation. So in a particular transaction, is that important for my client to be using the new contract form? Or does it not really make any difference if they can use the old one? For example, and we'll get paragraph 3A, we'll talk about the difference in cash and financing and if money's borrowed and if a particular transaction that affects, I mean, you've already got a transaction in a 1 to 4 family where the buyer's already borrowing the money, you've got that in paragraph 3, you got a third party financing addendum, then it's not as important a thing as if you were dealing with a cash transaction or some other type of thing. So it's going to come down to, as you work through that, what's going on in the transaction, but you need to know that difference. So as you advise your client which one to use and what to go, but you understand the difference, because if anything goes south on a deal and it ends up at Trek, Trek's going to see, well, did you provide the proper advice to your client so they could make a decision based on being educated, based on being knowledgeable about what the different forms did as they made a choice. Because we've got that obligation. So we'll find ourselves talking about from a Trek perspective and then about best practices. And your best practices come to your understanding of what's going on in a transaction. Remember, and Trek holds you responsible for this, by the way, you have superior knowledge of the transaction of the contracts. Then on the very back, push your, remind me when you got licensed.
This past week.
See, very, very new license. But remember, here's the key. Tell me your name. Tell me your name.
Kevin.
Kevin already knows more than what his clients know. Even though he just went through the classes, passed that gosh awful state exam, everything was good. Got to get it. Only what, 7 times? Okay, we're good. And so he's got it. But at this point in time, Trek holds you responsible for having superior knowledge to the public. And you have to be careful not to abuse that situation, take advantage of your superior knowledge in transaction. So we have that superior knowledge in the transaction. So we've got to advise our clients as we go through that process. Because Trek said, yeah, you got your license, you have superior knowledge, and that's how that works. Okay, so we'll talk it a little bit after we go through these changes, but right now we're in that interim period where you can be using the forms because the new forms are on the Texas Realty website. They're on zip forms. Unless somebody else knows, you may know. I don't know that they're in DocuSign yet. I don't know that the new forms are in DocuSign. So as far as I know, Joe, what do you think? Are they? I don't think they are. So if you use zip forms, which I like, I think zip forms are pretty good. They are in zip forms. The new forms are in zip forms as you work through that.
I made a mistake, Bobby. What I do have, the latest one was what my contract was done on. So
Okay, 20, you have the 20-17. Okay, perfect.
I verified it, but that was what was in the forms Friday.
Good. Yeah. So yeah, if you're using zip form and transaction, you automatically are on the right form. That's because it does it. Now, where it doesn't is if you've already been in the process of working with a buyer, for example, and you've got templates, and then you continue that buyer past February 1st, you still have the old forms in your templates. So you need to change that. You go through that process. Yes, ma'am.
The deadline is February.
February 1st is when the new forms become mandatory, and we'll talk a little bit about the transaction, what happens when you receive an offer or accidentally make an offer on the old form after February 1st. Because February 1st, the 20-16, when the 4-family contract is no longer a valid contract form. Now, is it a contract form the buyer and seller choose to use? Absolutely. But it better not be with your consent and your advice. You say, oh yeah, well, I don't really have that new one handy and I don't understand what's, let's just use the old one, okay? Wrong, you're in trouble. Right, well, bad to get all over you. And remember the rule. When truck gets all over you, in that room, right outside this room, a room right in there is Mr. Mike Brody, our broker of record. They also get after him. Now, we don't want to make Mike Brody unhappy, mostly because when you get a track complaint, and there are not very many of them, he gets it, he takes it, looks at it, says, and he hands it to me and says, Bob, take care of it. So then I have to deal with it. So don't let it happen. It just goes right up the line there. Okay, so let's look at the contract, the 1-to-4 family contract, 20-17. And you'll notice, the date up there, 11/7/2022. That's when this contract form was first approved by the Texas Real Estate Commission. It had been sent by Broker Lawyer Committee last summer, last August, first to the commission in their August meeting. And then they put it in the Texas Register, and in their November meeting, they finally approved it. So let's look at paragraph 3. And hopefully you've got the highlighted version. So it says the term cash portion of the sales price does not include proceeds from borrowing of any kind or selling of other property except as disclosed in this contract. A lot of hairs on that dog, a lot of variables involved in this. It literally means borrowing from any way station. Well, it's I've got a credit line down the bank and I'm just using that. So then I have to put a lien on the property. No, it's borrowed money. The concept behind this, they wanted to deal with the fact that buyers are making cash offers and really didn't intend to close cash. They were going to get financing and they're trying to close some of those loopholes. You're not able to close all of them as you work through it. Here's what this change is really doing for you. It's a little bit like the change in paragraph 4, where we're now addressing residential leases and fixture leases. These are things we should have always been talking about anyway, and we weren't. But now they're in the contract, so you have to talk about it. You have to talk to yourself. So you got some pictures here. You have any leases on them? Let's talk about that. Is there a tenant in the property? Let's talk about it. We've got a tenant to deal with it. Same thing here. What's ironic, and I presume it does not apply to anyone in this room or anyone on Zoom. The number of listing agents who don't ask buyer's agents for source of funds. Where's your buyer getting that money for that cash deal? Do they have a house to sell? Easily half, and I'm an optimist, easily half of listing agents don't ask, don't address it at all. That's crazy. But it happens every single day, all the time. And so what this is really doing is pointing out something to you, says, you know what? If you've got the listing and you've got a buyer who either this is a cash deal, 3A and 3C, same number, or it's a large down payment. This is telling you, hey, you need to say something. You need to inquire. You need to ask. Okay, that's good. So you're going to put 50% down. Great. That's a really good offer. 50% loan. That's really a good deal. By the way, that 50%, we'd like to know where that money is today. We'd like to know that it's in a financial institution in this country today. We want to know.
Or is it tied up in the house that you're trying to sell?
Right.
You forgot to.
Well, and then you'll further ask, do they have a house to sell? Do they have, or some other property to sell? Do they have anything like that? Because many lenders don't address it.
So how do we enforce this though? I mean, are they allowed, do they have?
It's not an enforcement. First of all, before we let our client get into a contract, we have those conversations.
Okay,
So our seller is making a decision. Now, there's no way to protect against a big lie.
Right.
It is what it is. But the reality is, as you go through the process, you need to ask, you need to get the information, you need to do all that you can do. And then based on some of that information and maybe do a little extra legwork here, say, okay, we did pull your name up in CAD. It seems like you do own another property. Tell us about that. Are you living there now? Are you going to move? What's going on? Do a little research, find out what's really going on to see if they are lying to you. Yes, ma'am.
so this What if can you still use a contingency?
What kind of contingency?
Like to sell another property?
Yeah, because see the very last word, as, you know, except as disclosed in this contract. So when the buyer makes an offer in paragraph 22, where we list all of our addenda, he puts in there the sale of the property by buyer addendum. We've now disclosed in the contract that a source of the funds for the buyer is a sale of that property. And so the seller has that information before he accepts the offer. So you do have that ability to create a contingency, whether it's sale of the property or financing or whatever. And we'll find that we address in a new paragraph in the third party financing addendum, the concept of hard money. And for the first time in the contract, we actually name a lender, which we haven't done before. And so we're going to talk about it. Now, the challenge with this thing, one, it's kind of an encouragement to you. Hey, ask some questions. You've got the listing. Now, not just if you got the listing, if you got the buyer, ask some questions. Ask your buyer, okay, great, cash deal, I love cash deals, by the way, where's the cash? Now, you're gonna get some flack from some buyers on that. You know what? Don't worry about it. I've got it. I'm good. You know, we don't need to talk about it. I'm solid. Really? I don't have the time, energy, and money to spend on somebody wishing and hoping. We had the great situation, and one of the agent de jure was one of our agents working with its buyer down in Park Cities, looking at 10, 12, $15 million houses. Of course, you can imagine there was a line out the door of agents wanting to show him properties. Young guy. And so he was at one of the properties that he looked at, and the seller happened to be there because the seller had a bunch of drawings and architectural stuff, things he was, you know, done the property. And the seller, who was an elderly gentleman, you know, once people get to a certain age, I mean, I'm not there yet, but you know, you pretty well can say whatever you want to say. And so he looked at the buyer, the young man, and said, you know how much I'm asking for this property? $9.5 million. It's a lot of money. You look kind of young. You got that money? I said, well, inheritance, which is pretty normal in that area. You know, inheritance. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, parents ways. Well, uncle, I'm sorry, when did he pass away? Well, he hadn't actually. But he's not looking good, and I'm on the list. I had no money. People were showing him property all day long. He had no. He might in the future, but so you've got to ask. You've got to find out what's going on. So one, both sides, buyer's agent, listing agent, both sides. You've got to ask. You've got to find out, and you're going to get some flack. I mean, some buyers are going to be insulted that you're even questioning their ability to buy. But you know what? It's okay with them to make you work for free. Sure. You know, they're not worried about that. So, you know, you gotta have those conversations.
Oh, no.
Okay. Again, it's-
It can make it easier to have those conversations is simply to say, sellers are not wanting to, you know, allow showings unless we have,
Now, there are certain sellers and certain price ranges that require for people to show that they provide a pre-qual letter or something. And that's true in certain situations. But the key here is make sure you've gone through the process. Now, enforceability is a huge question in this. For example, the buyer, you know, does a cash deal and he puts that in there, and maybe the listing agent didn't do their job and didn't ask or whatever, but they've been into a contract, and the buyer changed their mind later and they're going to do some financing, and we've had other clients deal with that whole process. And the seller says, well, no, it's a cash deal. You can't go out and borrow money. You can't do that. We don't know how enforceable that is. Because remember, at closing, it's all cash to the seller anyway. So, and when we go through that whole process, if the buyer wants to change and borrow the money, and there are sometimes, by the way, legitimate reasons why you might do that. When our interest rates were really low, 2.75, and buyers were making cash offers. And buyer's sitting there going, buying a property, $800,000 cash. And he's at lunch one day with his tax attorney. His tax attorney said, what? You're using up $800,000 of your cash? Have you looked at the interest rates? You get a loan for 2.75 and you're using your cash? What kind of idiot are you? I said, oh, I really hadn't thought about it. So it might be a legitimate reason to change the financing of those kind of rates. Today's kind of rates, probably not. as you work through that. So as we go through that whole process, you know, there are reasons. This really causes a lot of conversation. Your seller makes as much of an informed decision they can. The big thing the seller understands is there's a risk. Any buyer, even the buyer who's doing good, nice, normal 20% financing, and they've got a good pre-approval letter from a good local lender, or we're aware of, we know and everything, there's still a risk. We understand we're not going to make a big deal out of it, but we understand not all contracts close. And there are a lot of reasons why they don't close. My late father, he retired from the Air Force and spent 20 plus years, I guess 30 years in real estate. That's how I ended up in real estate. And he said, son, you know how come deals close? I said, no, Dad, but I know you're about to tell me. Deals close because sellers want to sell and buyers want to buy. As long as that's true, it's going to close. And he's right. If that changes in the transaction, either side, it may not close. Of course, the other thing, and if you've done this long enough, it'll happen to you. It's happened to me. The most tragic reasons that it closes, people die. People just die. And while you can vote in several states if you're dead, you can't do a real estate. Sorry, that's how that works. I deal with that. Yes, ma'am. Question, yes, please.
Oh, I have a client,
Buyer or seller?
I'm a buyer,
Okay,
and they have a house in Keyword. And they want to pull the equity out of their house to put down and pay for the house here.
that's borrowed money.
So
So if they're gonna borrow money, essentially bridge loan or something of some nature like that from a property they have in another area, that's borrowed money. And here's the key, they just need to disclose it. And when you've got a buyer who has a situation like that, and fortunately, we're in a situation right now where buyers in a little better position than they were 6 months ago, a year ago. They just need to disclose it, and you need to provide as much information to the seller and the listing agent that makes this good. You know, here's the deal. You know, it's a $400,000 property in a great market. They were 10,000 on. They got a huge equity there. Their bank has approved any bridge or anything they've got. Make it where you've done the disclosure, but it's not a big deal. But you've disclosed it because it is borrowed money. I mean, they're borrowing money. They may going to put a lien on the property or not, because not all lenders do. May just have a promissory note. You see that a lot with lines of credit and certain kinds of things with banks as you work through it. You just have to disclose. That's what you're going to deal with there. But you do it in a very positive manner. Because the key is the seller just needs to know this is a legitimate buyer who really wants my property and has the ability to buy it. And one of your jobs is to say, yeah, they do, and here's why we're saying they have the ability to buy it. That makes some nice sense. Great. Yes, ma'am.
It came up because during the Hunger Games of real estate the last 2 years that we had, there were buyers making offers that had contingencies, but not doing a contingency addendum, thinking it would hurt their offer because they were just going to get out of the financing, third-party financing. And there were plenty of people coming in saying they were all cash who didn't necessarily really have the cash, and they were trying, as soon as they got under contract, they were trying to switch to finance.
Yep.
Or some kind of conventional, but that's what this arose out of, is that.
It tries, yeah, it does, and it tries to eliminate that. Now, here's the other situation. And this comes from your knowledge of the transaction and the different timelines of the transaction. I'm not sure when we're going to have it, probably maybe April or May. We're going to have another class on dirty tricks of negotiation. Not to teach you how to have dirty tricks, but how to defend against them. And one of the tricks, and it all comes down to an intent, but a good agent with a buyer who really have already lost 3 deals, they can't afford to lose any more deals, so they got to make a cash offer. And they know they'll never be able to close cash ones. They're going to have financing, have to do something. But to keep the buyer and to make a good earnest money and put a good earnest money up and all, but to keep the buyer from being in default, the agency helps the buyer stay on top of timelines. Option period, major HOA, self-disclosure, other things, buyer approval, property approval, other things. We wouldn't have any of those if it cash you. But other things that create rights of the buyer so they won't be in default. By staying on the top of that timeline, the buyer can terminate the contract under those provisions and not be at risk of losing earnest money. I will tell you though, and we had a couple of those when the market was that way. Sellers were furious. Sellers said, you know, I know what you were doing. You were doing this from day one. You never had money. We just, you know, say, yeah, but you know what? Your listing agent never asked you. Your fault too. But seller is just dig your heels into it. You know what? Say goodbye to that earnest money because you're not getting it. You know, we're not signing anything in that deal. So the seller said, you know, we just know the game you're playing. And by the way, in some cases, that in fact was it. I mean, the buyer never intended. They were always going to try to do something. But they made a cash offer because they knew that was more attractive. But it was never their intent. They worked through it. Well, this is really addressing all that, but this is really your job, buyer's agent, listing agent, to really understand what this means in a transaction. Listing agent, I mean, the seller says, well, they didn't tell me about borrowed funds and they borrowed funds, so they're in default. You know what? That's a legal issue. You got to talk to a good attorney. Because then this gets in everything, not everything. Most of these issues in a contract, which is simply a bunch of promises from buyer and seller, all comes down to enforceability. Whether or not it's enforceable at any level, and a really good attorney says, you know what? It's a flip of the coin as to how enforceable it's going to be. We don't know what the judge will end up doing with it. By the way, here's what it's going to cost you to get to that point. So it's probably not worth it. Give up that 5,000 and move on. And by the way, giving up the earnest money, except for the emotional aspect of it, is much easier for the seller because it's not their money. They have to write a check. They don't give anybody anything. They just don't get that extra money that you thought you were going to get. So we give it with paragraph 3, the change here and what we got. Everybody good with that? Yes. Question.
Last time we discussed this, there was a big discussion around HELOCs, home equity lines of credit,
Borrowed money.
but it's borrowed money. And that the distinction between the borrowed money is if you borrowed the money and it's in your bank account.
Still borrowed money.
No, but it's in your bank account already. Like you took out the loan, so you have it sitting in your.
But remember what we do is we check the bank account, we look at the source of funds for the bank.
Yeah, but it's in the bank versus
Yeah.
they have a
It's
promissory.
going to be a seller's decision, and well, you know what, you basically have borrowed this money. And what we want to, the whole concept of borrowed money is there's a non-party involved in the transaction that can determine what's going to happen or not. It's really going to be a disclosure issue, kind of like in your transaction, make sure everybody understands, here's what we've got here. We've got the money for the large down payment, and here's what we got. We got it from an equity bridge thing from a house in New Orleans, or we got it from whatever the source might be. And so you do that disclosure. So what you want is a seller who's making a good informed decision, what you're going to end up with. Make good sense? We good? Your job is to understand how this affects your client in a transaction. If you've got a transaction, 20% down, 8% loan, sales price, you got a third party financing addendum, this is not a big deal. Because we know there's financing, we know there's borrowed money, it's already in the transaction. And we know what the contingency is, and it's in third party financing there, so not a big deal. So this is really a bigger deal when the source of funds is something that's borrowed or cash deal or down payment assistance program. What we don't know, and we don't know how TRAC is going to finally deal with down payment assistance programs. Because essentially that's kind of a borrowed money thing, but say, well, it's not really, it's kind of a. The people on certain is you're not liable for it, so we don't know what's going to happen there. We still know there's going to be some shaking out of all this whole kind of thing. Look at the second page, paragraph 5. Now, the concept of the change for escrow agent, we made it a defined term. The concept of defined term we see first of all in paragraph 1. Where in paragraph 1, the first blank with the name of the seller, and you have capitalized seller. Second blank, name of the buyer, capitalized word buyer. So elsewhere in the contract, you don't need to put their name again. You just put the capitalized word seller, capitalized word buyer. So in paragraph 5, in that blank, you put the name of the title company, not the name of the agent at the title company closing the transaction. Even though they really have a license and they're an escrow agent on TDI rules, reality is what we want to define here is the title company. We've got one right now, in which we've got title company and we've got a person's name, And that person's name there, not good because they moved, or they were down company. You know about this one, Janet. So you don't ever want a person's name in there. You want the name of the title company.
Why is it still in there then?
What's still in there?
That's real agent.
Because that is the title company. Under the TDI rules, escrow agent, title company are the exact same thing. That's who that is.
Not the person.
It's not a person, it's the company.
Yeah, the title company is the agent.
Yeah. So, when you put your public title in there, or a legacy title, or whoever you want to put in there. Elsewhere in the contract, when you see the word escrow agent, we know who that is. That's your public title, or Chicago title, or whoever it is. And that's all we're doing there with the defined term of escrow agent. We good? Question?
Yeah.
Okay.
He just said it's on the state exam and I.
Nice to answer that.
Oh, really? How'd you do it?
Oh, I read that one, right?
You got several right in your cast.
And I'm taking my biggest one is two right now and it's on.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good to know. Yeah, no changes, but I've had actually two agents. One sent me an email and the other was a text. About paragraph 6A8. On page 2 of the contract.
Your favorite, one of your favorites.
This is one of my favorite. We keep getting it wrong. We don't understand the concept of it. Remember, these 9 items, 6A, 1 through 9, are exceptions to the title insurance policy. How come you're saying these are standard printed exceptions? If you got a problem with any of these areas, we can't help you. You knew about this before closing, and if anything goes wrong later, that's your problem, not ours. You knew about it. Exception. Number 8 is the survey exception. And the title company says, you can change this exception. It's the only one that you can amend that exception, and we see the language. And what happens is, if you amend it, the phrase shortage in area is the only thing that's left. All the rest of it goes away. So when you look in your title insurance policy under standard for exceptions, you get number 8, all that's there is shortages in area, which is the exact square footage of the land. So if you've amended it, you've got coverage for overlap, protrusions, encroachments, all those others, but you don't have protection for the exact square footage of the land. You can't buy that out in the owner's policy. The mortgagee's policy can, but not in the owner's policy. The buyer can't do it. Now, the concept of doing this is very important for an existing survey. For a new survey, if there are mistakes on the survey, you've got the survey. I still think, even with a new survey, I still think you ought to have, you ought to amend this because survey companies go out of business. Sometimes they're small shops, people die and retire and things like that. So if there's a big mistake on the survey, you may have nowhere to go. You did not amend it. You can't go to the title company because you didn't do that amendment. You didn't change it. There's a mistake on a survey. An existing survey, you have no recourse against this survey. So if they made a mistake on it, can't go to them because it wasn't made for you. Your only recourse is the title company. And you only have that recourse if in fact you go ahead and amend it. And you've got that choice and you check out amend it, and the guy is going to pay for it. Buyer ought to pay for it. It's a minimal fee. It's 5% of the cost, 5% of the premium of the title policy. So if your title policy costs $2,000, it's $100 to amend this coverage. And you know, your buyer gets to decide if they're going to do it or not going to do it. If they're going to pay for it, have a seller pay for it, where they going to do it. Jana?
When you say the rest goes away, what goes away?
No, the risk doesn't go away. What it does, and it's a good question, what you have when you amend it is if you've got a problem with a mistake on a survey in any of these areas, except for shortage area, you can file a claim with the title company. Whether or not that's going to work or not, you never know. It depends on what's going on. But what you're saying to the title company is, I bought this property. We've got a title, we've got a survey here. It's a new survey or existing survey or whatever. I've amended, and we've got an encroachment here. And I want to file a claim with my title insurance policy to deal with this encroachment.
I just.
Doesn't make it go away, it just
I thought you
gives
said
you,
something was going away, so we
No.
can add this.
nothing's going away, it just gives you that ability to file a claim to the title company. That's all you
Maybe
can do.
in addition to, but
What?
amending what's already present.
So say again,
It's really an addition to, but it's, has to be called as amended.
because it is an amendment to the printed exception.
Already present, so in our mind, though, we're adding further protection.
We're changing an exception, so I'm not sure it's added protection. What you're doing is you've got these 9 exceptions,
Yes.
standard print exceptions to the title insurance policy. And what you're doing is you're saying, one of them, number 8, which deals with the survey, we're going to change it. So if I've got any of these things besides shortage and area, and they're a mistake on the survey, and that's what we're talking about, mistakes on the survey, I get to file a claim with the title company. Whether or not that's going to work or not, we don't know. No guarantees, but it's so inexpensive, buyer ought to do it,
So
especially in an existing survey.
we should always choose will be amended.
Yeah, you already recommend your buyer, will we, especially that buyer who's just paying 10,000 more than list price? Well, what's his $100 I gotta pay? Well, dummy, pay this. Anyway, so you're gonna recommend it? Yes, ma'am.
When you do, let's say you do get a new survey, then
Yeah.
that's when you can do I. Yeah, okay, you do that, and then if you get it, I mean, 9, 8, or I, 8.
Okay, so will not be amended?
Yes, if you.
You're in a little better situation with a new survey,
Right.
because if there are mistakes on the survey, you can go after the surveyor. But remember the problem sometimes with survey shops?
Yes.
Small, go out of business, die, whatever. So that's a risk the buyer sells tax. It's less of a risk on a new survey. You should always do it on existing. Always.
So when you say a new survey, you mean a survey done specifically for this deal?
For this transaction, that specific transaction, you checked off 6C, 2 or 3. Existing survey. You've done a new survey, you're the buyer gonna obtain, you pay for it, or seller gonna obtain? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, what was the last time you were saying?
I'm gonna
If
say,
it's a survey done for that particular property,
all
so
new surveys, by the way, when the title company orders up survey, it's in the name of the buyer. It's gonna be in the name of the buyer. So that's a new survey for that buyer. Okay, Joe, so let me clarify the question. Question. We have a question. I need to make sure we cover it.
His question is, what constitutes a new survey?
A survey for that specific transaction. In the contract, in paragraph 6C, where we talk about survey. Either 6C2 or 6C3 is a new survey. All that's different between 2 and 3 is who pays for it.
So I have a perfect example of the deal I'm doing right now. There was 5 acres, somebody bought, they built a barn dominium on the back of it. They cut away 1.3 acres with the existing house on there. They're selling the 1.3 acres with the house, keeping the other 3.5 acres. They had a survey done December 21. This is just a year later. That survey is not good. Because even though it's a newer survey and only a year old, it's not a survey specific to this contract that we're doing and negotiating right now.
Existing survey.
And the problem is, because it's acreage out in the country, the sprinkler system is outside of their well and septic system. Like the sprinkler heads are on the other, they didn't cut it up right.
Encroachment, overlapping protrusion, you got a challenge. But the key is, what she's talking about is an existing survey. A new survey, when the buyer chooses 6C2 or 6C3 for this transaction, he gets a new survey that's in the name of that buyer. What she has was a survey that was done last year, which is a few months ago, 2 months ago, whatever, done last year. And the seller is giving the buyer that existing survey. And buyer said, yeah, that's pretty recent. That's great. I can do that. But it's an existing survey. And any mistakes, the buyer can't go after the surveyor because it wasn't done for that buyer. It was done for the previous buyer.
I would never do acreage without.
Oh, gosh, we have a new survey. And the problem with acreage is that they're far more expensive.
Yes.
And so a buyer won't say, yeah, it could be thousands of dollars. Absolutely. So you gotta be careful. Do I have another question over here on 6A? You good? So the recommendation, first of all, is the buyer needs to know they can or cannot amend, and if they're gonna amend, here's why. They need to know, especially for existing surveys, as you work through the process. And they need to know it doesn't make anything go away. All it is it creates a situation where if there's a mistake on a survey, they can file a claim with the title company. That's all it does for them.
Because the survey's in their name. And so they,
Well, because they've amended the exception. By amending the exception, they've created a right that if there's a problem, they can file a claim with the title company. Because they paid the title company money, it's a settlement, it's a line item on a settlement thing, it's whatever the fee happens to be.
That means it may or may not be able to get any restitution.
Oh, yeah, the title company may say, no, you knew about that before you closed, no help, okay? Or a title company may say, oh, yeah, we missed that, okay. Now, the key is, if it's an encroachment, for example, we've had that. Probably the next door neighbor got an encroachment and a lawsuit ensues. If you file a claim with the title company, they step in your place and have a lawsuit. It can be a huge benefit as you work through it. So we good, 6A? Am I? Bob, that is still clear. So next time we have this in the class, you can teach it.
I'm doing a great job.
Okay. Look on page 4 of the contract. This is our longest paragraph in the contract, paragraph 16. It's got all these notices and everything, title notices and all. And we've got an interesting conflict that will at some point in time, we think might be resolved. Legislature might address it. Track may encourage spoken word committee, but we've got a 6E dealing with number 11. They're on page 4. Page 4 of the contract. The following notices have been given or attached to the contract, for example. This is essentially addresses the PID thing, and we'll see in paragraph 22, we've removed the addendum for PID. Because it's not an addendum, it's not an agreement between the parties, it's a notice. Now, unfortunately, even though they put this language in number 11, if you've got a notice from the PID, which is often the case, you can put that in there, but we still have number 7 above. The last sentence says an addendum containing the required notice shall be attached to this contract. That language shouldn't be there. That creates a conflict with 11. So we still are going to find ourselves dealing with, you can still use, because TREC still has that addendum. Deal with the PID, you can still use that as you notice. We generally prefer the PID provide their notice or the MUD, but PID is what we're specifically addressing here, because there is no MUD addendum. There's only that pen, but the PID one, but it's still a notice, an agreement. So if you've got a PID notice, you're going through a transaction, here's where you go and put that information down and work through that. PIDs are still a mess. We're going through that process, what they are, what you have on a particular piece of property. Many times tells you, I have no idea. So, well, let's look at your tax roll. Let's look at what says in the tax. And in some cases, PIDs were fairly new, haven't even assessed anything yet. We don't know what the fees are. And then yet they've got typically in most cases, a 20-year payout. So PIDs are still a mess. So rely on, if you've got the seller and seller information, have the title company help you do a search and go through the process and find out what you got going on. Or you can go to, there's a national website dealing with PIDs. You go to that and pull up that specific property and find out if there's anything. You good?
Yes.
Now, page 5. Paragraph 7F. This is as a result of all the fussing we've done about getting something from the seller who's done the repairs. Well, we need an invoice, we need a receipt, we need something. Because it was not in the contract before. And so most of the time what you did was you added it to your repair amendment. Seller must provide, and we've got our own language, must provide legible, paid up invoices, like language similar to what we have in paragraph 7F. Because otherwise sellers not required to do it. In the current contract and the old contract, But now they have language in here that does two things. One addresses that and also addresses transfer warranty. When you look in the middle part where seller shall provide buyer with copies of documentation from the repair person showing the scope of work and payment for the work completed. At seller's expense, arrange for the transfer of any transferable warranties with respect to the repairs and treatments of buyer closing. Let's be clear. These warranties are only warranties involved with repairs that have been agreed to, not anything prior. Let's say that 3 years ago, he had foundation work done, had a warranty for that. That's not what that addresses. This addresses repairs that have been agreed to in this contract.
Okay.
And it's at seller's expense. Used to be a buyer's expense. So that was changed.
Can you repeat that again, please?
Pardon me?
Can you repeat what you just said, please?
Yeah, this establishes any warranties that are specific to repairs that are agreed to in this contract. Either in the original contract or in the repair agreement. Not previous things that were done. So if 3 years ago, you had foundation work done and you had a warranty from that, that's not what this addresses. This addresses when the buyer and the seller negotiated this contract and then a repair amendment, and the seller agreed to do certain repairs, he agreed to put a new roof on. And there's a transferable warranty on that roof. Well, the seller at the seller's expense must transfer that warranty to the buyer according to this paragraph, because that's a repair that was made under the terms of this contract.
Yes.
Question,
We're talking about how good this is.
Yeah.
what's good to happen? Now, what should you add to this?
Sometimes
How many days before closing?
Yeah, let's give a time frame. Yeah, I don't want any closing. But yeah, it's in the truck on the way to New Jersey, you know, we'll send it to you. Buyer's not gonna not close the transaction because he didn't get it. And it's an uphill battle on holding the seller in default.
So is that the timeframe, is that something that's being considered by TREC?
No,
That's something you put in the repair amendment.
what you've got is all you're gonna ever have. What you've got is what you've got, that's it. What you need to do, either in paragraph 11, special provisions, is put a timeline in there or put it in the repair amendment. Now, I would advise you if your buyer says, yeah, I want it 3 days prior to closing or whatever, you do need your timeline. Really do. Sure. So you may want to. One of the other words that I thought should have been included in this, obviously documentation. I'd like to see the word with legible. copies. Some of these repair people, you can't read what they. Yeah. What was that, $500 for? But it talks about, and from showing the scope of work done and payment, so it's an improvement. It's certainly better than. Got it in the contract now, so we know to address it. We don't have to worry about adding it to our repair memo. Question, are we good on that? Yes, ma'am.
Are you good with us specifying who does the work or does it?
Okay, so, and deal with the repair amendment. And it's a great question because it gets to one of my little preferences. I think when a buyer requests a repair of a seller, the buyer will name who's going to do it. Or create a serious requirement from page 5. Or create a serious requirement that the buyer approve who's doing it. And we'll have another one, we'll have another class this month. Probably not next month, but we might. Talking about the language we have in repair amendments. Because one of the things I keep seeing, and I don't understand why. I learned a valuable thing last week. The things we've talked about, things that I'm pretty comfortable, everybody understands. Last week, one of our top agents sitting there, I was talking to Marcia and we were talking about this particular point, and the agent looks at us, what are you talking about? You heard of it? Talks about it in multiple classes. What do you mean you never heard of it? And we're gonna actually talk about it a little later. So I know one of the things that I've said, don't have the buyer say to the seller, AC to be inspected and repaired or replaced as necessary. Terrible, terrible phrase. You've given up to the seller and the contractor the decisions on what to do.
And to determine what's necessary.
Yeah, because we can't do that. We got to back and say, here's the problem that's come up from our inspections. We've got an HVAC person come out and look at it. Here's what has to be done. This is who we want to have do it. Seller, we'll let you cap the cost. We'll negotiate on that. But here's what it's, I'm not going to give up to the seller or a contractor the decision to decide what needs to be done and who's going to do it. So Gene, you bring up a great point. Buyers got to make that decision. Otherwise, you're going to live with whatever the seller does. And that's wrong. Just, you can't do it. And if you're the listing agent, if you're the listing agent, don't let that language be in there. Make sure you've got clear, because what you've got is a minimum is potential for a dispute. And remember, and I've talked about this several times in class. Any language that shows up in a repair amendment, I don't care who originated it, both agents are responsible for the language from Trek's perspective. Trek says any language you let your client sign off on is your language. We don't care who wrote it. We don't care where it came from. It's your language. Donna, you had a question?
Oh, the darn ACs. The sellers-
Darn AC, those darn AC.
And the sellers are so proud because they've had them serviced and maintained by the same HVAC company, and they'll just have their guys come out.
Yep.
Yep.
It happens all the
Yep.
time.
Oh, absolutely. So here's the Zoomers, if you can't hear some of the conversation, please let me know so I can repeat it. So Donna was talking about the fact that seller has an AC company who has for years maintained and serviced the AC. They've done a great job, and the seller wants them to do it as you're going through the process. Disclose it to the buyer and let the buyer make the decision. Buyer says, okay. Our inspection said, yeah, this has been good, or these things popped up. And we're happy that the seller has had this maintained, taken care of, probably why it's in reasonably good condition, but here's some issues that came with the inspection. So the buyer's got to decide, do they want that same company to do it? Or do they want to name their own company? And that becomes a negotiating point. One of your jobs as an agent is to help them negotiate this. Because it is a challenge. Very often sellers, in fact, situation, I'm trying to remember who the agent was. Seller not only had this maintained for years, seller owned the company. So the seller said, but you don't like my company? I mean, was that you, Dana?
No,
It's probably Tommy.
Maybe Tommy. Dana, and then Joe. Dana, you had a question?
Freddie Flex Seal. The commercial says on a leak on the AC does not constitute a repair. I had an agent I was working with and helping out. The seller just had his guys Flex Seal.
And see, that's because you left it up to the seller to make the decision. You can't do that. Joe?
What about the instance when the amendment says a required a licensed HVAC or a licensed electrician?
Okay.
And the seller says, no, I have my handyman guy that does the work all the time.
Okay, so let's deal with Joe's specific situation, dealing with licensed repair persons. Go back to paragraph 7F. Where it talks about seller should be all repaired and obtain any required permits. Must be performed by persons who are licensed by such repairs or treatments or no license required by law, and it goes on to and commercially engaged in trade. We only have a few licenses in Texas, not roofers, not foundation companies. Neither of those are, and HVAC is only a certification. Mostly it's plumbers, electricians. Now, and we've had this happen, and so far we've been okay. There are a lot of things that handyman, because they're commercially doing this, can do. For example, putting in GFCIs. Minor electric work. Now, what the buyer may say is, okay, we're okay. In fact, buyer says, we've got one that we use a lot, so we're gonna have them do it. But we want it signed off by an electrician, or an electrician to finally sign off on the work. But you're right. We already have in 7F of the contract that, and we're going to see when we look at the amendment one of the changes we made or that's been made. The amendment is referencing to paragraph 7 of the police repairs. Because we addressed that license factor. What's misunderstood, as I kind of mentioned, is a lot of things don't require a license. Some big things don't require a license.
It's crazy that a foundation work wouldn't require a license, but somebody to cut your hair does.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it takes more education. It takes more education and more hours to get a license to cut hair than it does to be in real estate. 1,500 classroom hours to get a license to cut hair.
Wow.
Now, part of that is because you deal with health issues.
Right.
You know, you deal with individual things. So there are some reasons as you work through it. And they've got continuing ed, just like we have continuing ed. But big items like foundations and roofs. We used to have a requirement, warranties for builders. And the builders lobbying group was successful in getting rid of that. It's really hard. If all of a sudden you try to create a license for foundation companies and roofers, it's a big battle. And you've got two groups you're going to fight. Well, actually three, but for both of them. One, you're going to fight the lobby for that group. Second, you're going to fight the legislature. Legislature doesn't like anything that they consider an obstacle that gets in the way of people being able to do something. If a guy wants to be a roofer, let him be a roofer. That's okay. She'll be able to do that. That's a business. Let him go into business and be roofers. And let the market take care of whether he's doing a good job or not. It's not our problem. We've got enough legislatures and that's a hard obstacle to overcome. And that's just the nature of that beast. But yeah, you want to make sure as you go through it. And where we get to a problem is some of that stuff, if the buyer, and it's why if the buyer is not very clear on the language for the repair, we need to make sure, and if you get a little nervous, maybe in the interaction with the seller in the transaction, it's pretty clear that the seller done a really good job maintaining the house. He's a really handy person. He does a lot of it himself. And buyer has a whole list of repairs. So, oh, good, that's fine. It's not a problem. We can handle that. We can do that. We can do that. Buyer, if by the way, if the buyer says, okay, that's fine. You've done a good job on the house. We're okay. You're doing that. Buyer can agree to that. But they're going to have to agree to that because in 7F, seller can't be doing it. Unless you've got that seller who owns the AC company or he's handyman or he commercially does that kind of thing, then it allows him to do it. But if you've got the listing, if you've got the seller in a situation, you want to make sure you disclose because you want to do everything you can to minimize potential disputes as you work through that. One of your big jobs. Very good with that?
Sir.
Paragraph 8, minor, change in who licenses home warranties. It's not track anymore. It's Texas Department of Licensing Regulations, GDLR. It doesn't really affect anything or anybody or whatever. Under closing, it talks about private transfer fees, which we also addressed in paragraph C of the HOA addendum that establishes who's responsible for those, which is the seller unless otherwise agreed to. And there are always, unfortunately, legislation for each sort of exception. A6, our favorite paragraph 11. Remember, that's where you practice your creative writing skills. I'm going to practice my creative writing right there, paragraph 11. We
All on the back of the paper if you want.
Waste of our space. I mean, they've only got 2.5.
actually have created lines now.
Yeah, that's
So, which is a change. Back in the good old days, that was a huge blank.
Yeah, it was. We put all kind of stuff.
And I was on the board of the learning committee when we had to play with this. So, we're giving them too much room because they're using it. Anyway, so the concept of this is really in the new language. Intended for use only for additional information. Different information items. Additional item is a statement that completes a blank in a contract form, discloses further factual information as provided or provided instructions. Real estate brokers and sales agents are prohibited in practice law. This is just one to a lot of people I know. And shall not add to, delete, or modify any provision. Now, the concept of this, even business details, And we talked about a couple of situations. Even a business detail that the buyer and seller want to put in here, or time for something, whatever. You have to have from your client something in writing, such as an email saying, here's what I want to put in paragraph 11. Here's something I want to add to the contract. They need to send you the specific language. So they now have instructed you to insert in paragraph 11. It can never be you coming up with it. It can never be you deciding to put it in there. Your buyer said, yeah, to our seller, and we're okay with this. Let's do that. So, okay, send me written instructions. Telling me to put in paragraph 11. Otherwise, Trek is so geared with this. I mean, they got it here. They also have some language in the repair amendment. In the amendment form that deals with the same kind of issues in item number 9 of that. As I've mentioned before, Trek has actually created an unauthorized practice of law working group that looks at the situation. And most of that is focused on paragraph 11 of the contract and 9 of the amendment. People, we joke about, but the reality is you really should see this as something that you very, very minimally use. We want everything to be covered in the contract because the contract is pretty comprehensive. It's really addressing pretty much everything the buyer and seller need to address and to agree on. Do what?
It's gotten longer. Contract.
Yeah, but for good reason, right?
Hey, Bob, this is Laura. I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have an offer that's being written, and in the seller's disclosure, it says there's a roof warranty or a foundation warranty or whatever, but nothing has been provided. Can that be under special provisions without practicing law, a request for a copy of the warranty and information?
Okay, so this is not dealing with agreed upon repairs. This is something that was previously done.
Correct.
Okay, paragraph 11, special provisions where the buyer should instruct you that the seller is to provide that warranty at seller's expense. They should put that language in there. But we want that instruction from the buyer. Now, here's
Perfect.
the thing. You tell your buyer, they've got to contact that warranty company and make sure, one, they're still in business.
Right.
And that the warranty does exist, because many of them have requirements that the seller had to complete and do in order for that warranty to still be in business, to still be a viable warranty. So the buyer's got to
Okay.
do some research there, but yeah, special vision would be a good place to put that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Should leave anything blank, and if we aren't going to use 11, should we?
Yeah.
N/A?
Yeah.
Just leave it blank.
Yeah, I think that if you're on the buyer side and you don't have anything you're going to add and you're making an offer, I think N/A in paragraph 11. The reason we like it in A, we don't like blanks because we want people to know we've noticed that blank, pay attention to that blank. We're aware of it. And we don't have anything that needs to go in that blank. So it's a good thing to go ahead and put that in there so people know that you checked it out.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a good thing to do. And we see that in a number of places in the contract. We want everybody to be aware, hey, we're aware of this saying, we just don't care if it's fine. Paragraph 6D, objections. If a buyer doesn't have anything, they want to create a basis for objection, put an NA in there, tell them, we have seen the paragraph and we know we have certain rights for objection, but we don't have anything. So we're going to put an NA in there.
But they put residential use in that blank instead of NA, it drives me nuts.
Yeah, don't put residential use.
But then people do it all the time. It's
The
like,
only time you should put residential use is if it's a question.
yeah, I know.
You're in a mixed use area and you need to know that, hey, I can have a shop downstairs, yeah, or you're in Houston, which is,
Yeah, that makes sense in Houston, but
Yeah.
not in Dallas.
Well, it exists in Houston. It's never made sense.
Okay.
I was in real estate 5 years in Houston. It never made sense. And people, you can always tell somebody who came from out of town, why is there an auto shop next to my nice house? Because there's no zoning. Whatever you want to there. And by the way, you notice they got chickens in the backyard. Okay, that's fine. Paragraph 13, prorations. It clarifies in here some things, and the concept of prorations deals with things that people are responsible for. And we see that we talk about this, in the Metro HOA addendum, which references to the prorations paragraph. For example, the seller of the property owes property taxes through the day of closing, because he doesn't pay them till the end of the year. But he's liable for taxes through the day of his ownership. The buyer is responsible for taxes after, now, moving forward in the process, for his ownership, whatever that might be. And so you've got that proration things we go. Sometimes you'll have a buyer who's paid an HOA dues in advance. Well, they have a right to have proration. They have a right to get money back from the time that they didn't own the property, but they paid for it. And so that addresses what you're dealing with there, and maintenance charges and things like that. Just a clarification on the proration. Paragraph 18, there on page 7. Same concept. Remember, the reason we don't have to put the title company's name there is for escrow agent, it has a defined term. There is some good language here. And you need to understand both sides. You need to understand as you're dealing with the issue of the earnest money. The title company has a right, if someone has incurred fees under the terms of the contract and they end up getting the earnest money. Let's say, for example, the seller agreed in paragraph 6C3 to pay for a survey, and a survey was ordered up. Title company ordered it up. They've got a bill for it, but it doesn't close. And let's say in the transaction, the buyer and seller agreed that the seller's going to get the earnest money. Title company can take the cost of that survey out of that earnest money going to the seller before they give it to them. And if it's the buyer who's getting the earnest money and they've got costs they've incurred, title company can take that out of that as you go through. We also have language in here that title company, that parties agree that if it doesn't close, that the title company can, before they release any earnest money to anybody, title company can require a release of liability from all parties. That's in paragraph 18. Now, paragraph 18C, demand. And this language was language directly from the title companies in Texas. When I served on Brooklyn Lawyer Committee, we had that language because it was language that was literally created by the Title Company Association in Texas. And it created a scenario that most title companies will respect. It's when one party makes a demand for the release of the earnest money. If after 15 days, the other party has not made a written objection, the title company can release the earnest money and not require the other party to sign a release. So they've got just one set of signatures. Now, unfortunately, even though that language is there, there are still some title companies that's still going to require everybody. But at least it gives you that possible situation where if your client makes that demand and the other side does not object. Now, if both sides object, both sides make the demand, all bets are off. You got to have everybody sign a release. But at least creates a situation where you can do it and work through that. And then indeed, we just talk about the damages, and damages are a really challenging thing in the courts because if you're not able to determine the amount of damages, which is really hard to prove up, working here and say, well, what damages are we on an offer? We used to have in paragraph D, we had it when I was on the committee and they changed it later. We had an automatic that if in fact you wrongfully refused to release earnest money, they got blamed wrongfully refused to release, then damages were triple, 3 times the cost of what I got. They took that out because you can't really determine the exact amount. You still have that ability that if you wrongfully refuse to release earnest money, you've got damages. Our challenge still is, and we knew it from day one. Jerry Prager, who was the attorney in our area, very respected attorney of record for Metrotex and for Netrix. He said, as we kind of worked through, he says, how do you define wrongfully refuse? That's hard. We don't know. And it's still that challenge working through. at least it gives us that potential that you can kind of push the buttons and work through the process. Go to page 8. Yeah, page 8. In paragraph 21 notices, we created a situation with a copy to buyer's agent, copy to list to sales agent. You also have space under buyer and seller. And remember, you don't need to put their name. You don't need to put the buyer and seller's name. In here, because why do you not need to put their names?
Starting in the contract on page 1.
By term, paragraph 1. But you beneath that, put, your transaction coordinator, put their information in there as you work through that. Remember our policy. And every attorney I know, even the good attorneys who like me, they might be wrong. Our policy is you have to have your email in 21 in the conversation. Because we don't want, and we have had it happen. Our client got an email, got a notice that we didn't know about because our information wasn't there. And we were up the creek. So if our client gets a notice, so do we. So your email has to be there. And at least we now have a good space for you to put yours in there. That's good. And you also want to do your transaction coordinator and work through that. In my sense, good. But
So our,
your email has to be there.
I'm sorry, so where is our email supposed to
On
be?
page 21, paragraph 21, page 9, right there at the bottom, there's this with a copy,
Oh,
the buyer's agent with a copy of sales agent, they now have that language in there. So put your email in there.
Agent's email, correct.
Yeah, the agent's email, your email right there. Which means that whenever a buyer sends a seller a notice, or a seller sends a buyer a notice, they copy us, because we're in paragraph 21. And all my attorneys friends said, wow, that's nuts. Do you know the kind of liability you have if your agent gets a notice and they don't do anything about it? Well, if my agent is in an active contract and they're not paying attention, shame on them. We'll accept that liability. What I won't accept is my client getting a notice that we don't know anything about. So we will go in there all the time, every time. Yes, question.
Does the title company, are they required to follow the instructions in the notices? Are they required to include us if we've instructed them such? I've had title companies that just ignored that.
Cannot ignore it because the seller and the buyer have agreed in paragraph 21, this is where notices go. And the seller and buyer now have agreed that a copy goes to the agent. Title company has to operate on the instructions of the buyer and the seller in the contract.
Okay, thank you.
So when you've got a title company that says, no, we don't have to do that, have their attorney call me.
I will.
And we'll have that conversation. And we'll also put them on that back list of title companies we may not want to do business with.
Thank you.
Because you're not paying attention to the terms of the contract. Paragraph 22. We still have that addendum for the PIDs, even though we addressed that in paragraph 6E11. You can use it, make use of it and work through the process. So that's what we've done in the contract. But the key hope of what I hope we're doing here. When I'm in class, the world keeps going. I don't understand that. What I really want you to pull from this are the concepts of all the changes. Because the reason you need to know the changes is for the next month, you can use the old contract 20-16 or the new one, the 20-17. And when you consult with your client and say, here's why we should use the new one or the old one or whatever. If you got the listing and you get an offer on the old one, you ought to let your client know, okay, here's the difference between the two. Here's why it's okay or not okay for you to accept that on the old form. For example, a cash transaction. You want to really have a conversation with the seller about, here's what we need to talk to the buyer's agent about dealing with this buyer who says they're going to pay cash. Because that was a big change in paragraph 3A of the new contracts. Makes sense? Good? Okay, go to the third-party financing addendum. You should have a stack there of the various addenda that have been changed. We've added a new paragraph. Paragraph 1G. Is in golly. This is where, and we're dealing with this because we were having some real problems. A lot of these things, these changes came from the field. Working Alert Committee kept getting these emails from associations, from realtors, text realtors and say, hey, we got to fix this. And one of them was the hard money lender. And they say, okay, because that's what you're looking at in G. If you look at the hard money lender, notice we've got a place first time anywhere in a contract for the name of the lender. So you're gonna put the terms, you're gonna put the name of the lender. Now, what we don't know, part of the question we've got, okay, they put ABC hard money lenders in here. Does that mean they can't shop around and change that? But ideally, if they are gonna change it, they should amend the contract. Remember the rule for an amendment? No one is required to agree to amend the contract. So the buyer said, I'm gonna change from ABC lender to XYZ hard money lender because they usually get a better deal here. And they request the seller to amend it. Seller says, okay, fine, I don't care. As long as the terms are still the same, because the terms create the contingency work through it. But for the first time, we actually have the name of a lender. We don't know how enforceable this is. We don't know if the buyer's in default, if they end up closing with a different hard money lender. We don't know. And the attorneys we talked to, including a couple on the Broker Lawyer Committee, saying, well, we just kind of wanted this to start. We'll see. We'll see. So. But anyway, so that's what that's for. That's why that's here to deal with that. And if you've got a buyer on a hard money lender, the big thing is we're letting the seller know. Yeah, they're borrowing money, and this is it. The big thing on most hard money lenders is what's important to them is the property. They can care less about the borrowers. Hey, the property is our collateral. We're making a loan based on the value of that collateral. So hard money loan can be good if a seller has a good piece of property. Doesn't have a good, by that I don't mean doesn't have to be in good condition. Most time you got investor buyers, you got hard money lender for the process. One of the interesting things, somebody said, I don't know, boy, why it's really expensive hard money lender. Yeah, but what if you have, instead of a hard money loan, what if you have a partner? You're paying them 50%. That's kind of expensive. So it's easy to make whether or not the investors are going to go hard money lender or a partner or, whatever. So, but at least that's good information there to be able to work through. Yes, question.
Will you clarify something for me? I mean, I feel really like
He asked me a question. I gave him an answer. He totally different. Yes, sir. What?
Okay. I should know this, but I don't know. Are hard money lender and mortgage company, are they?
It's actually a good question.
Because I mean, there are people.
We've got three categories aside from owner financing. We've got conforming loans, conventional loans, conforming to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac guideline. We've got FHA loans, conforming to those rules. And then we have this whole group of what we call portfolio lenders, which would include hard money lenders. And these are people who are looking at the property. They're saying, okay, property looks like it has a value of $100,000 and a guy worth $50,000. That's a good ratio. It's a good collateral thing. We'll do it. And the hard money lender is bound by very few rules. They're not bound by any Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac rules because they're not going to sell the loan to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. More than likely, the property doesn't even qualify for that. Maybe a different side of the mainstream property. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac only want to buy a loan with mainstream properties as collateral. You got a property in East Dallas and the foundation is Bodart blocks. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac won't buy it. That's not traditional. That's not, we can't do that. It's not mainstream.
Or you're out like.
What?
Here, Easter, all over Paris and all that area out there have.
You visit Paris?
Well, no, I'm just.
Okay. So the key is, hard money lender is someone who's loaning money based on the value of the collateral. It's not Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA, it's whole separate groups. Now, some lenders do portfolio loans, which they totally keep in-house. They kind of follow that same category. Although occasionally a lender will sometimes, if it otherwise qualifies, will sell their portfolio loans, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, get money to do more loans. But hard money lender is totally in-house.
They don't sell the loans out. They carry it.
Yeah, they carry it. It's a little bit like, we told the note. buy the car and the lot precedent, or that title max, all those, things, we built the note. So they built the note. That helped.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do what?
Think Guido.
Guido.
Guidos are.
What? That sounds like discrimination. It's all the Guido. Just say,
Now, I
yes, ma'am.
was backed by financial institutions.
Taking away the name of a Guido. You got a guy over on Harry Hines. And one of his businesses is make loans for people who want to buy houses. And he gets a great interest rate on it. It's a short-term loan, rarely more than a year. Of course, the price to do what? Oh, yeah, it's right. The user limits on that's far greater than on normal.
It's like double.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
7%, it's 14K, 20%.
But it's just, it's an individual, or it could be a company, be an LLC, hard money LLC, whatever. But it's, I don't know of any banks, there are money lenders, but there are banks with portfolio loans, there are banks that work off a line of credit, things of that nature.
Can portfolio loans have higher interest?
Sure. As long as they're fall under the qualifying ratios, the usual laws for a particular state as you work through it. On page 2 of the third party financing addendum and security, this just establishes if a lender requires it, and most do, not all, then they're going to require that this property be secured by a vendor deed trust lien. In other words, property is going to be collateral for their loan. Because remember, when a company loans money, when a lender loans money, their first recourse is the borrower. They want a good borrower, good credit score, all those kind of things. That's their first recourse. Second is the property. So that's why they do an appraisal. That's why I check out and make sure that it's good. But in order for the property to be collateral loan, they've got to have a deed of trust lien that backs up the promissory note. Promissory note is just I owe you money. Deed of trust lien actually establishes that property is now collateral, and if you don't perform under the deed of trust lien and the promissory note, I can take the property. Yeah. 99% of all lenders don't want the property. They want the money. They're in the business of income. And they want that income to continue to come. They don't want the property. Property is a hassle. And depending on the property, if they thought theoretically did a good appraisal when the market shifts, they're gonna lose money if they take the property. And they all kind of challenges. So and then number 5 on page 2 here. They've expanded a little bit, so we now have that information under B, seller, buyer, authorized buyers, lender, title company, escrow agent, disclose and furnish a copy of the closing disclosure and settlement statements to the parties, respective broker, sales agent. So we now can have that settlement statement. I have that disclosure. We didn't have that same language before, so we now have that. Jeannie?
You don't have to do the TILA for me?
Pardon me?
You don't have to do the TILA? TIL?
No.
Okay.
Got it right here.
Okay. Cool.
You good? Okay, go to the HOA addendum, the next addendum you should have in your package. What you have?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, paragraph C, we continue to fight the battle. Who has to pay what? And the battle is with the HOAs. Because they want to say, well, buyers have to pay this or sellers have to pay this, or that's what they did. Well, what they've tried to do is they try to continue to tighten up the language a little bit. Buyers shall pay any and all association fees, deposits, reserves, and other charges associated with the transfer of the property. In other words, these are fees that because the property is transferring from one person to another person, these are fees that come up. If these fees, are not as a result of that, it's not involved here. You only get to deal with who's going to pay these fees, and you get the buyer says, I'll pay this amount, and seller's going to pay everything else. If it's anything, the buyer will have to pay anyway, prepaid or whatever that's established, then it didn't fall under this because it was not related to the transfer of the property. So it's got to be related to the transfer of the property. They also established some new rules. A seller, for example, can request the subdivision information as defined in paragraph A, which includes a resale certificate, they can request it and not have to be in contract. They don't have to have a buyer. They don't have to give the HOA a buyer's name. Say, we want it because we're gonna list the property and we want that information so that when we get a buyer on it, we don't have to go through the process. In fact, because we've got a buyer, we can have a buyer in a contract check off A3. Because the buyer's already got all this subdivision information, and the only choice to be made is do they want an updated resale certificate based on the timing of the one they have now. So it improves the situation for the seller. He can go ahead and get that information now, he's gonna have to pay for it. Go ahead and get that information now, so that a buyer, rather than checking off A1 with all those termination rights, he can go to A3, which is better for the seller and the buyer. You need to understand the A3 and how that works. Because what happened is we're so used to certain choices. We're used to the A1. And that's the most typical choice of buyers, yeah, which creates significant termination rights for the buyer. Totally right to terminate for any reason 3 days after receiving the information. So when you get one with A3 and you're the listing agent, and we had this happen, we have one of our fine agents. And he called me and said, Bob, well, these people are always trying to get away with something. I just can't believe what they're trying to do here. I said, well, an HOA addendum, let's check it off A3.
That's a good thing.
They checked it off, they're trying to pull something here, aren't they? And I said, well, let's look at A3. This is actually good for your seller. You know, here's what we really got going on with A3. He said, oh, I thought because it wasn't the normal A1, I thought it was a problem. He hadn't read it. He didn't really go through the process and look at it and see that in his situation, A3 was a good choice. Because he had the subdivision, he had the resale certificate was the big thing. It was timely because the resale certificate is good for 180 days. Unless the title, or something otherwise. So A3 is good. All you're dealing with in A3 is an updated certificate. It was a fairly recent updated resale certificate. There's no problem. So you just need to be comfortable with it. When you get an offer, it's a little different. It may be, maybe really good for yourself. I have a question.
Oh, you're not on mute.
Oh. Hello.
Yeah, I had a question. I got it. I got a question.
Go ahead.
And I'm going back to the third-party finance addendum. And it is on, if the loan is not approved, there is nothing in the new paragraph 5 that tells us that they have to disclose or that we get evidence that they weren't approved for the loan. Is that correct?
Okay, so you're talking about property approval on the second page of third-party financing.
Get yourself while you
Correct.
answer.
If they do not get their loan,
Okay, if the lender does not approve the property. Is that what we're talking about? Paragraph 2B, second page, third-party financing?
well, not
What
even
we're
if the
talking
lender-
about?
the property
Go
doesn't
ahead with the
qualify, but the
background that
buyer
needs to be
doesn't
himself.
qualify.
You, he's not on mute.
It needs to be
You're
muted.
hearing yourself.
Oh, me.
He needs to mute himself.
Okay, so clarify for me, I'll clarify. Is that what we're talking about? Is paragraph 2B, property approval, the lender does not approve the property for whatever reason? Is that what we're talking about?
No, it's buyer approval.
Is that what we're talking about? Okay, so 2A, buyer approval. Okay, buyer approval deals with a specific time frame. The number of days in that blank. Right? So you're looking on third party advice now, paragraph 2A, buyer approval. The buyer has a certain number of days and if they.
Yes.
Or if they decide they cannot obtain it from that time frame. So what's the question?
Do they have to provide any evidence that they were rejected for approval based on the new information in line 5, which allows them to disclose any lender information? There's no requirement, or is there a requirement that they would have to disclose that they could not get lender approval?
Okay, technically, you don't have any language in 2A that says the buyer must have something from the lender. Showing they, don't meet the requirements, credit income and credit history. However, there's a rule that most attorneys point to in business code that the buyer must make every reasonable effort And if a lender does not approve them, they really need to provide something from a lender. The lender says, no, we've got clear language in 2B, what a lender has to do, but not as good in the 2A. So if you've got a buyer who's terminating under 2A, it'd be prudent for them to have something from the lender saying, yeah, we don't approve it for you, insufficient funds, for example, quit your job, great, whatever. It'd be prudent to do it because the challenge is you've got a battle between the buyer and the seller. Seller says, well, how do I know you haven't been approved? Or is this just a easy out? Well, technically it kind of is. But we still have to deal with this potential dispute between the buyer and the seller on what's going to be required. Because if the seller digs his heels in, one of the things the buyer wants is they want to be able to terminate to get their earnest money back. So no. You know, the reason we chose your offer is you're in the Hall of Fame for borrowers. We chose you over all the other buyers because you and your agent said how you're great. Now you're telling me you can't get approval? You're not getting the earnest money. Heck with you. So if you can at all, if you've got the buyer, try to get something from the lender saying we don't approve them, and here's why. We learned it till you live for 20 years in Oklahoma, and we just can't live with that. And I understand that's a problem. So, yeah. Is that semi-answer?
What if you lived in
Yes,
Mississippi?
thank you, Bob.
Yes, sir.
Says yes, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Okay. So, okay. So, are we good on the HOA, Daniel? Okay, let's go to the residential lease. Addendum regarding residential leases. You got the buyer. How in the heck could you be in a contract with a seller and not know there's a tenant in the property? And it happens.
Well, because the seller didn't disclose.
Oh, did you not, were you not at the property?
Yeah.
Did you go to the property? Did you inspect the property? Did you, was there, and sometimes you won't see anything in MLS about tenant. You know, they won't disclose that. And maybe the tenant's not there when you went out to look. I mean, there, but as a buyer's agent, you gotta ask, you gotta make sure, because there's some serious responsibilities of the seller and rights of the buyer in this addendum. And you need to be familiar with this addendum. If you got the buyer, our recommendation will always be to the buyer. Don't close unless the tenant's out of the property. Unless the reason you're buying it is because there's a tenant there and you want to own this property with a tenant. Thank you, Donna.
Thanks so much, Bob.
And that's the reason you're buying. Well, then make sure you understand your new responsibilities, because there's a provision here where the buyer is buying the property. There's a tenant in there, certain things that they get to do and so forth. As you work through it. And there's certain clear disclosures and statements by the seller. We see that, you know, in B3 as you work through that. But what we have, the seller says, oh, yeah, with the tenant in now, his lease is up at the end of January and he's moving out, not a problem. So, you know, we're good with the closing for February 3rd. It's good, not a problem. Because remember, nothing in the contract between the buyer and the seller does anything to the lease between the seller and the tenant. The tenant says, well, you know, now that we think about it, some things have happened and we really need to stay here another 6 months. Are you gonna do? Yes, ma'am.
And another essential reason for doing the buyer's walkthrough, the final walkthrough also.
Yeah, make sure they're gone.
Make sure they're gone.
You just got to do it. So you need to be familiar with this lease with regards to which side you, obviously, if you have the seller on the listing side, make sure the seller understands this. And make sure that if you go through the process, when you talk to your seller, says, oh yeah, this is not a problem, tenants move down any day now. Once he's out, let us know.
Yeah.
Because we got to let every prospective buyer know, here's what's going on. Because it can be a huge challenge, but make sure you're comfortable with this as you work through the process. And if the buyer is not buying it because there's a tenant there, make sure in writing, you've advised them, do not close until those people are out of this and they're gone. That's done. Because that buyer, when he takes ownership of that property, he's the new landlord, he's responsible for security deposit, performance of a written lease and like that. Now, the change they made here in dealing with B1C is dealing with oral leases. Because we were having situations where tenant had been there 10 years and they started off with a lease and they've been in an oral lease for the last 5 years. And so we're dealing with oral leases here. But if you've got the seller in the situation, make sure the seller understands all the things that they're disclosing in B3. All the things that are going on there as you're working through it. I cannot overemphasize, when you take a listing, you got to make sure you understand what's going on with the property. Because it's not true all the time. You don't meet the seller at the property. And you don't know what's going on with the property time. Everything is what the seller's telling you. And you're going through that conversation, you work through it and deal with it. So. Now, the next form is our bigger challenge. So, yeah, fix your leases. What's our problem with fix your leases? Do what?
Fix your leases.
Well, fix your leases, then those ever a
As
problem.
a buyer, it may not be able to afford the lease. Because it'll put them out of the bracket based on what they can
Now,
afford.
they may not qualify
Yeah.
to assume the lease,
May not transfer, they may not want it.
may not want it. Our first problem, though, is as a listing agent, knowing is there a fixed lease? Because we have that now, paragraph 4, we have to talk about it. We didn't used to talk about it, but we should have. As we walk through the property and we see what's there, as you notice, solar panels and all those other things, is, okay, tell us. Lease? Oh, no, we own it. Okay, good. Free and clear? Or is your financing? Oh, well, it's bank financing, but it's not a problem. We're good. Really? So are you going to sell this property and continue to make payments on that loan? Or do you expect the buyer to make payments on that loan? Do you expect the buyer to assume that loan? If you've got a seller with solar panels, and that's our best worst example. They got solar panels. If they own it, it's not a lease. You don't use this addendum. This addendum is only if the fixture is a leased fixture. So you got to find out. And if it is a leased fixture, okay, then you need to make sure you've got a copy of the lease because you have to give that to a buyer. Buyers ever take a look at that, have an attorney review it. You cannot review it. You cannot look at that fixture lease, that solar panel lease. You cannot review it and give any advice on it because it's not a track document. You go down that road. Janet?
What if the property, it's the solar panels themselves are purchased, but the service to service those panels may be some type of a different agreement?
If there are any obligations to a potential buyer, such as some kind of a maintenance contract, seller needs to disclose that. And seller should have something in writing to determine that, okay, we've got these solar panels, they're all free and clear. We got this monitoring stuff for security, we've got this maintenance thing for solar panels. And here's what the company that we're in contract with requires if we sell the property. Those got to disclose that, buyers got to know, and it may create some problems with their qualifying ratios as they work through it. How do you do it? So as a litigator, you got to ask some questions. What's going on with this stuff? Security systems, solar panels, those are the two big ones. You got a bunch of others that are listed here, especially out in the country, propane tanks, water softeners, things of that nature. But you got to have a conversation and don't take the first thing the seller said. Oh, yeah, we own those. Okay, well, let's talk about that. How do you own them? Is there a loan on them? Is there a secured lien? And is there a UCC lien on it? You know, what's actually going on here? You got to find out. And then the thing to add in here under B3 deals again with oral fixture leases. I got to own up to you. I've never encountered an oral fixture lease. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know what circumstances those would be. But you just need to be pretty familiar with this so that you understand what your buyer decision. Now, the thing I would add, even though it's theoretically got language in here, in paragraph A2, where it has language in there that if buyer's not assuming it, seller will repair any damage to the property caused by any removal. If it's solar panels on the roof, you probably need some additional language. You'd have some language where the buyer's going to approve it prior to closing, all that kind of stuff, because sometimes you can have some serious damage to the roof if you remove solar panels. So you need to make sure your buyers really thought through that and decided.
Where would we put that additional language?
You'd put in special provisions, yeah. The oil and gas addendum, which is the next one. The big thing you need to know about that, even though they've got some things here that talk about anything that's part of whatever. This is incredibly complex. Oil and gas man or landman, oil and gas carrier landman. The key is a buyer would never initiate this. I can't come up with a case in which they would. The seller's the one who's, I will reserve some of, or reserve all of them or half of them or whatever. Then seller makes certain choices in here. The seller would generally say to prospective buyers, no matter less, we're going to reserve our mineral rights. So when you make an offer, make sure you include the addendum. And here's what we want. Our challenge with many sellers is they don't even know what they have. They really don't know the value of it. They've got a previous lease or whatever, and so they still know.
Question.
Yes.
I had a property that we looked at one time with a client, and they had it was a couple of acres, but they had a cell tower on the property.
Yeah.
And they wanted to retain the monies, the money rights, the lease right for the cell tower, even though it was above ground.
So we have situations with cell towers, microwave towers, windmill, things of that nature, windmills, those kinds of things. And so it says, I negotiated a contract, I want to get the royalties. That takes an attorney. Attorney's gonna have to draw up the language so the seller and the buyer know what they've agreed to and continue, for the seller continue to collect royalties on whatever that is. Because it's fairly complex.
Like, why would you buy it with your? Yeah.
Well,
I can understand there was good money of it, so they wanted to retain it.
yeah, and buyer may say to seller, we don't work this out, seller, we're not gonna factor that into the price at which I'm selling it.
Yeah.
Because this is pretty good monthly income. We go out to lunch every week on this discussion, all right? But it's complex, just make sure. Yes, ma'am, question?
If the seller does retain that buyer agrees, but you said the seller may not even know what they have.
Yeah,
Is it filed somewhere, or how does this?
no, his interest already is in public records.
Okay,
His lease is already in public records.
because I feel like kind of a dummy because our daughter bought a townhouse here in Plano and the seller insisted on her signing it. It's a townhouse over there by the hospital.
Probably no value at all.
Okay, because I'm like freaking out, like, okay, is this a problem?
There's some places right around the DFW airport, like in Grapevine and stuff, that I had a friend who owned over there. And because of the natural gas by Grapevine Mills Mall, they were receiving, the whole neighborhood, everybody was receiving $1,000 a year or so. So they wanted to retain those mineral rights. Because it's not.
They can do that. They can retain those. There's one subdivision, I don't remember what the name of it is, over in Arlington. That the subdivision is negotiating with oil and gas people, and they have a lease for the entire subdivision. And all property owners are part of it.
Well, Lewis knows it.
You what? The drilling underneath.
Yeah, it's a certain distance from the well. You have to pay to everybody.
So let's look at the amendment. We have that additional language, paragraph 2, the amendment paragraph. The references to paragraph 7, we've already talked about on dealing with warranties and repairs and so forth. And then in paragraph 9, which is comparable to paragraph 11 in the contract, the division where we're dealing with you guys going out and continue to practice law. I don't know what the deal is with that.
Oh, wow.
Just. I said, Bob, have you not explained to them they're not allowed to do that? What do you not think about it? Maybe I should do that. Maybe I should tell them they're not allowed to practice law.
We like creative writing.
They should. They can't be given legal advice, can't be practice law. Now, on the next one, the sales temporary lease, go to the second page of the sales temporary lease, paragraph 23. We think the legislature just missed it. In a temporary residence lease, it's for both of them, buyers and sellers. It's a temporary residential lease, and it's got essentially a 90-day timeline because there are exceptions in a temporary lease, Chapter 92 of the Texas Property Code, which regulates landlords and tenants' rights. You see this in paragraph 21 and paragraph 22. You got exceptions there. You got exemptions. Where on the smoke alarms, the landlord doesn't have to go and make sure they got installed, the same thing on security devices. Well, they've also got the language in paragraph 23 where landlord is delivered to tenants, landlord flood plain and flood notice. We use and you got the addendum page, the Texas Realtor addendum 2015. And they reference here to the track 154-0. So here's right now until they make the change, and we hope they will, and create an exemption for 23 like you did 21 and 22. If you've got a buyer and the buyer's going to make an offer and they already know up front that they're going to do a seller temporary residential lease, the buyer has to provide this addendum you see on the next page with their information. The buyer is the landlord. Now, the concept of this is that the reason that the landlord has to disclose to a tenant, because it's a temporary residential lease, the buyer is the landlord, the seller is a tenant. If there's a flood and the tenant has their personal property damaged because of the flood, and the landlord had not disclosed they were in a floodplain, floods could happen, then there's a liability there. And recourse on the tenant to the landlord can deal with all the damages to their personal property. So that still applies. That's in the property code and still applies. The practical side of it is, remember, these are usually for a short time, a few days or a few weeks, rarely ever much more than that, sometimes 36, 9, but in a short time frame. So the chances of in that time frame a flood happening and, the tenant's personal property gets damaged and they go after the landlord for, hey, you didn't disclose us that what's going to happen here is a problem. So what you got to do, just because it's unlikely, but still could happen, is when you write that offer, your buyer needs to complete this form and they're going to say, not aware, don't know, and as the landlord sign off on it and the offer and the tenant signs off on it. And what's silly about this is when the buyer does this, where are they getting the information? From the seller. And thanks for the information, by the way, here it is back. You can have it. So still have to do it. Now, you've all heard that. That's what our agent last week said. Well, I've never heard about that. Was that news? Well, we talked about it. Talk about it again. Everybody listen up. Okay. Now, a buyer's walk through this next form. Walk through confirmation acceptance form. You need to have this in every transaction. You need to use it. This is a really good form. It's an expanded form from the previous one. And it's great protection for the seller and frankly for the buyer. It's good. If you've got the seller, you ought to make sure they require, unless you got something in the contract, I can't require it. But you ought to have buyers, complete this, sign off on. Because it has all kinds of things like do inspections, walkthroughs, all that. It's really, really good form as you work through it. Yeah.
We also have an in-house disclosure of the buyer does not want an inspection.
Yeah, we have some in-house forms that are in our intranet. And one of them is that is if the buyer does not want to do an inspection. And even lenders aren't required, you don't require it. I mean, they require some things, but not inspection. And we have a form that we give to the buyer saying, hey, you should do an inspection, here's why. We got a form in case they don't want to do a survey, they don't want to do a title policy. And if it's a cash transaction, they certainly can do not do a title policy. But we've got forms that they need to sign off on, acknowledge that. We got a form if a seller accepts an offer, silence, and all kinds of good additional information kind of forms. Now, let's talk about, and I brought it a little bit up at the very beginning, what's going to happen February 2nd. When you get an offer and the offer's on the old form. That says, hey, you got to provide your client with the most current appropriate contract form. And you've just received an offer and it's on the wrong form. What you have to do is present that offer to your seller. You don't get to call the buyer, chain and say, hey, obviously you haven't been in class. Because you should know what offer, it's on the wrong form. What are you, an idiot? Jeez, you know, what's going on here? You don't ever do that. Because all of a sudden you just run off a buyer. And if it's not a hot piece of property and this is the only buyer to show up, you have to present all offers to your seller. So you present your seller, you say, okay, here's the deal. Here's an offer. And it appears based on our conversation, it's a really good offer. It's on the old form. And here are the differences. It's a nice 20% down financing name, so the change of paragraph 3A don't really mean anything. Here are the things, here are the differences in the contract form. None of that affects you. The seller says, well, this is a really good offer. I'd like to accept it. I'd like to be in contract. Seller gets to do that. You want to make sure you advise them in writing, such as an email. You receive an offer, it's on the previous form. I hear the differences. You've been advised on that, and you've instructed me that you want to go ahead and accept it. And so you go ahead and accept it, you go through that process. Your client gets to make that decision. Follow the rules of track, you know, make everybody aware that, hey, that's the wrong form, and it's kind of how that goes. And you're good, but your client gets to make that decision. Now, if they're going to counter, go ahead and counter on the correct form. Go ahead and change it off to the correct form, the new form, and send that counter over. Because there's no reason to continue this offer counter offer on the wrong form if you work through that. You will have it happen. If you've got listings, you'll get an offer on the wrong form. We have it pretty easily the first month of the changes. If you've got a buyer and you got it in that old templates and you accidentally do it on what you'll find, by the way, sometimes depending on the agent on the other side, you send the offer over on the wrong form and you get that snippy call from the listing. That's a pretty good offer, but it's on the wrong form. Did you guys talk about that? Oh yeah, I hear Bob Baker's offer. I know you, maybe you talk about that. Just live with it. Move on. Oh, you know what? You're right. You want me to go ahead and do another offer and do the right form? Yeah, work it. I can. But it will happen. Make sure you do it because make sure you follow the rules of track, but also make sure you follow best practice. And your key is protect your client as you work through it. Any follow-up questions, Zoomers? You have anything? We good? Thank you, everybody, for being here. We appreciate it. Everybody had a happy new year. And we'll see you guys on the second class later this month.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
What is
Thank you, Bob.
Sure.
When you read it, it's. Yes, they.
Long day.
And